Jean Bodin, Apostle of Sovereignty. Part 1. Sovereignty in the State. After a brief and abortive stab at a life in religion, Jean Bodin began his adult life as a student of law. Despite spending some years teaching at the University of Toulouse, he was unable to find a permanent academic niche for himself as a university professor. So, in the 1570s, he changed career and became a government official at the French court. He published his 6 Livres de la République in 1576, which Murray Rothbard described as perhaps the most massive work on political philosophy ever written, and certainly the most influential book on political philosophy in the 16th century. Bodin's life as a courtier came to an abrupt end when he opposed some tax measures of Henry III. The remainder of his life was devoted mainly to scholarship, apart from some years in the late 1580s and early 1590s, when he was once again thrust into the spotlight of royal politics. Aristotle is not Bodin's only model. He was well acquainted with Machiavelli's works, and while he couldn't share Machiavelli's disregard for moral principles in politics, his historical predilections inclined him to give the practical purposes of the state a central place in his analysis. The state is the means to the good life for its citizens, but not directly. It merely provides the conditions by which the state subjects can live good and pious lives. And while Machiavelli had no use for religion except as a propaganda tool for the inculcation of obedience in the state subjects, Bodin was a genuine believer in divine law. Just what Bodin's religious views were, was and is a matter of controversy. He was suspected of being a Calvinist, even a Judaizer. That controversy was aided and abetted by his most intellectually and religiously ecumenical colloquium of the 7 about secrets of the sublime, a work not published in his lifetime, in which the interlocutors are Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Muslim and skeptic. The current scholarly view appears to be that Bodin was and remained a Catholic, although a critical one. It's a commonplace among commentators to note that Thomas Hobbes' political theory in the Leviathan was in part an existential response to the confused and fraught religious and political realities of his time, resulting from the constitutional and later armed struggle between Parliament and King. What is not so often noted is that some 75 years before Hobbes produced his Leviathan, Jean Bodin's République was a product of very similar existential conditions in the religiously conflicted France of the 16th century. Marion Tooley notes that civil war inspired him with a horror of rebellion and the anarchy that comes in its train, and convinced him that the politiques were right and that the only remedy was the recognition of the absolute authority of the state, to which, after immortal God, we owe all things. The politiques were a party in 16th century France who, in the context of the religious and political disturbances of that time, took the view that the primary function of the state was the establishment and maintenance of order, and not the establishment of the true religion. Bodin may have shared with the politiques their view that state authority had to be absolute and sovereign, but beyond that there is little or no evidence that he shared any other of their views. Although Bodin and Hobbes started from much the same political conditions and arrived at much the same conclusions, the differences between the two men in method and in general philosophical feeling are as marked as the similarity of some of their conclusions. Bodin adopted a scholarly approach, a mixture of scholasticism and history, taking Aristotle and Machiavelli as his intellectual mentors and lacing his work with citations, illustrations and digressions. Hobbes, by contrast, a devotee of the new scientific method, applied the method of geometry to political philosophy, as Spinoza was later to apply it to ethics. And you can search the Leviathan in vain for historical references or illustrations. It is generally agreed that the work of Jean Bodin is notable for its prolixity and occasional lack of clarity. George Sabine, for example, remarks that Bodin's books are unorganized and ill-arranged, repetitious and disconnected, though in parts he was capable of being clear and cogent. If this is so, why does he have an honoured place in the history of political thought? Well, first of all, it cannot be denied that Baudin's thought is far from being perfectly consistent. However, such confusion as there is results primarily from Baudin's being an intellectual trailblazer, creating the very paths that others would follow. So, it is hardly surprising that on some occasions his paths should crisscross. All that being said, Baudin is famous for one thing above all, and that is his conception of sovereignty, an idea that political theorists and indeed the general educated public now takes for granted, but which was not always clearly understood or appreciated. The introduction of a single concept might seem to be a very slender basis upon which to build an entire scholarly reputation, but as Julian Franklin notes, Baudin's account of sovereignty was a major event in the development of European political thought. His sharp and clear account of sovereignty was a distillation of elements which had been, as it were, in the air during much of the 16th century, and for some time before that, but which had not, before Baudin put pen to paper, ever been so clearly expressed. The medieval period had been dominated by interminable and unresolvable discussions on the proper relationship between the sacerdotium, that is the spiritual powers, and the regnum, that is the temporal powers. The concept of the state with which we are now all too familiar, and which depends crucially on the idea of sovereignty, was at best embryonic in the thought of Baudin's predecessors. Certainly, it was nowhere fully articulated. With the possible exception of the authors of the Defensor Pacis, Tooley writes, no one in the Middle Ages asked, what is a state, and how is it constructed, but only, who are the rulers, and what are their powers? Baudin changed all this, not only for himself and his contemporaries, but for all subsequent political thinkers. The use of the word absolute in the account just given may give the not unreasonable impression that Baudin was a supporter of political absolutism as this came to be understood in the political debates of the 17th century. This is not so. Baudin's absolute is a somewhat more nuanced notion than that which is normally taken to be. The sovereign who is absolutist, that is, set free or made separate or unbound by positive or municipal law, that is, but not unbound by divine or natural law. In addition to this, Baudin envisaged the sovereign as operating in the context of traditional restraints of various kinds. Baudin stood for centralized state authority against feudalist pluralism and decentralization of political authority, writes Heinrich Raumann. But he never doubted that all such authority is subject to and limited by natural and divine law. Therefore, the modern concept of absolute sovereignty could appear on the scene only after positivism had freed sovereignty from the limitations which Christian tradition and the ideas of natural and divine law had placed upon it. As well as being absolute and perpetual, sovereignty for Baudin was indivisible and necessarily so. By such indivisibility he meant not just that every system of law must embody some principle of ultimate determination, but that if political incoherence were to be avoided, the ultimate powers of government must all reside in one entity. Whether that entity was to be one human being or one group, such a claim was not obviously descriptively true, even of the quasi-absolutist regimes of his own time, let alone of all the rapidly emerging European monarchies. Still, it might be argued his thesis is prescriptive rather than descriptive, so that its failure to match up to the political realities of his day is no great fault. This account of sovereignty was not always held in precisely this way by Baudin, but had developed over time. During his time as an erstwhile professor of law at the University of Toulouse, Baudin had encountered the idea, known as mirum imperium, that certain officers of state exercised the power of their offices by, as it were, the right of the office itself, and not merely as a power delegated to them by the king. In the context of emergent absolutism, some thinkers attacked this notion, but Baudin did not entirely concur with this attack, holding that such officers held some undelegated powers, but not any powers that could place them in competition with the king. Franklin writes, Baudin divided the mirum imperium into a minor part that could be held by magistrates and a major part held only by the prince. This distinction, of course, immediately gives rise to the question of which prerogatives belong to which part, and it was by attempting to answer this question that Buddha eventually found his way to the doctrine with which he has come to be so closely associated. For methodological reasons that need not detain us, Buddha engaged in the mid-1550s in an historical and comparative study of different politics, with a view to determining a set of the essential elements of sovereignty. By the time he came to write the 6 Livres de la République, these elements included the authority to appoint magistrates and assign them their duties, to make and unmake laws, to initiate and terminate wars, to be the court of last appeal, to make determinations of life and death in situations not envisaged by the law as it stands, the right to receive homage, to tax, and to determine coinage. Buddha's list of elements is a distillation of the writings of various jurists, but, significantly, he comments that no matter how much power they, that is, the rulers have, if they are bound to the laws, jurisdiction, and command of someone else, they are not sovereign. Buddha held that sovereignty to be sovereignty had to be indivisible. It is true that sovereignty, as Buddha defines it, can only be unitary, but it doesn't follow from this that its unity needs to be embodied in just one person or just one corporate body. There is no logical impediment in having a unitary sovereignty embodied in any arrangement, the parts of which are divisible from each other. Franklin remarks that Buddha's idea that sovereignty is indivisible was thus based on serious confusions, and I think we can agree with that. Again, sovereignty may be absolute in being the locus of all legitimate power, but unless one holds to the indivisibility thesis, this does not produce an absolute monarch or an absolute assembly. Correlative to the idea of sovereignty is that of subjection. The sovereign is sovereign over subjects, and subjects are subjects to a sovereign. No sovereign, no subjects. No subjects, no sovereign. Of course, there are many other relationships that may obtain between individuals, religious, social, fraternal, but none of these involve of necessity the notion of sovereignty. Given the religious and political fragmentation that had arisen in the 16th century, together with the existing local groupings, different patterns of customs and local laws, even different languages, one can see why Buddha is choosing to prioritize one particular relation among all these to constitute the political tie that binds. What is this sovereignty then? Well, it is supreme power over subjects, unrestrained by positive or municipal law. It is perpetual rather than merely limited in time. It is primary rather than delegated. It cannot be alienated and cannot be circumscribed by prescription. In every state there is a sovereign. This sovereign may not be an individual person, it may instead be an assembly. But whether a sovereign is ontologically singular or plural, sovereignty is always unitary. If there is no sovereignty to be found, then, Buddha thinks, there is no state. In a sovereign state, all authority other than that of the sovereign is either illegitimate or is delegated. Even if a state, to be a state, has necessarily to be sovereign, and thus possess a unitary centre of legitimate authority, it doesn't necessarily follow that it must operate directly from this centre. There is no principled objection to decentralization. Buddha even favours such a policy. Here, Buddha, again a man of his time, recognized the continuing existence of various forms of corporations and had no practical desire to see them prorogued or eliminated. The consequence of his theory of sovereignty was that all such corporations, insofar as they possess authority, did so, ultimately, as holding it in a delegated form from the sovereign. The sovereign, then, is the supreme lawgiver, and the law is simply his command. His law-giving requires no consent from anyone, inferior, equal, or superior. And if customary law continues to function, it does so only with the consent, implied or express, of the sovereign. Thomas Aquinas had held that prescription could alter statute. Buddha denies this, and instead asserts that statute can alter custom. Law, that is lex, proceeds from the sovereign. Divine law, that is equity or jus, proceeds from God. In an ideal state, there should be no clash between those two types of law. If there is, however, no subject can take it upon himself to remedy that legal dissonance. Buddha's understanding of divine law was taken exclusively from the Old Testament, and despite his acquaintance with Calvin's works and its recurrent themes and topics, it is significant that he never mentions the notorious chapter 13 from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Buddha was sufficiently a creature of his time to believe that the sovereign was responsible to God and encompassed by the natural law, but neither of those constraints affected in any substantive way his sovereignty. Of the three types of law, divine, natural, and municipal, only the last is the product of the prince's will. Buddha's sovereign, unlike Hobbes' ruler, is obliged to keep the covenants he makes with his subjects. Hobbes' ruler, as we shall see, makes no covenant with his subjects at all, but is himself the product of a covenant they make with one another. In what way is the sovereign obliged by covenants? Well, not by positive law, for there is no way a sovereign can be obliged to obey his own command. There remains only divine and natural law, and the keeping of covenants is therefore a matter of natural law. However, as we have seen, unless the sovereign voluntarily submits to the sanctions of divine and natural law, the subject has no way of enforcing them. Though the sovereign is not in any way obliged to seek advice or consent, Buddha thinks it expedient for him to do so in normal circumstances. An advice-giving council is desirable, as are the estates that constitute quasi-representative bodies. If the sovereign's laws are to run, since he cannot do everything himself, there must be magistrates to give them effect. In Buddha's account of sovereignty, there is, it would appear, little to prevent the autocratic exercise of power by the sovereign. He has no superior or equal, he is the sole source of municipal law, and that law is simply his command. If he is subject to divine law, its sanctions lie beyond this vale of tears. If the sovereign's law is a matter of his will, and if his will is not in conformity with divine law, how is such a tension to be reconciled? If he is subject to the natural law, who is to enforce its dictates against him? True, by natural law, even a sovereign is obliged to keep his agreements, but should he fail to do so, who will enforce his obligations upon him? Buddha agrees with Calvin that the state is a consequence of sin. He differs from Calvin in making that sin to be one of injustice against other men, rather than an affront to God. The state originated in violence and is expressive of man's lust to dominate his fellow men. Buddha writes, "Force, violence, ambition, avarice, and the passion for vengeance armed men against one another. The result of the ensuing conflicts was to give victory to some and to reduce the rest to slavery. The man who had been chosen captain and leader by the victors, under whose command success had been won, retained authority over his followers, who became his loyal and faithful adherents, and imposed it on others, who became his slaves. Thus was lost the full and entire liberty of each man to live according to his own free will, without subjection to anyone." On the other hand, in his more Aristotelian moments, Buddha takes the state to emerge from a desire for mutual association, partly to repel and defeat acts of violence, partly to promote social ends. But Aristotle wasn't Buddha's only inspiration. On the origin of the state, Buddha takes a route that will be familiar to those who know the work of Hobbes. Buddha writes, "The origin of all corporate associations and guilds is rooted in the family. With the increase in numbers, it became no longer possible for them all to inhabit and find sustenance in a single place, and they were compelled to spread abroad. Gradually, the villages grew into towns, each with its separate interests and distinct locality. As these communities were originally without laws, without magistrates, and without sovereign rulers, quarrels easily arose over such things as ownership of some spring or well. In response to these occasions for quarrelling, men associated for the defence of their homes and families, others to attack those in possession, and to despoil and destroy them. The activities which were held in the greatest esteem among primitive men, says Plutarch, were the massacre, slaughter, and ruin of their fellows, and the reduction of them to slavery. Yes, this same sentiment would be repeated later by Hobbes. Buddha continues. This license and impunity in preying upon one another compelled men who knew neither rulers nor magistrates to join together as friends for mutual defence, one against another, and institute communities and brotherhoods. The disorder resulting from lawlessness and lack of a common magistrate forced men into associations for mutual defence. This story that Buddha is telling resembles that which will be told by Hobbes, except that Buddha recognizes, as Hobbes does not, that human associations are held together not only in the face of a common danger, but also out of mutual affection. Tooley puts this well when she writes, Buddha could not go quite so far as Hobbes and define the Commonwealth as a number of individuals united solely by their individual subjection to a common power. For he thought of men as naturally sociable, and any association of men is based on mutual amity, even more than on justice. But sharing Hobbes's acute fear of anarchy, he was possessed by the same conviction that the recognition of an absolute sovereign power was the only bulwark against it. Where there is no such power, there can be no political society. Buddha gives a central role in his political thought to the family. The family is a natural social entity that is the basis of all other communities, including the state. The boundary of the family is the limit beyond which the state cannot go. Buddha would have liked to restore to the family the old Roman idea of the paterfamilias with all the draconian powers such a personage had. If the family is one rock around which the waters of the state must flow, so too is property. In fact, Buddha links family and property closely together, so that the proprietor of property is not the individual as much as the family. Property thus becomes a family attribute. Though the state is composed of families, nonetheless state and family are separate entities and have different attributes. If property is an attribute of the family, sovereignty is an attribute of the state. Political authority, sovereignty, is not a form of property relation. The prince or king does not own the public sphere, and he is not in a position to alienate any of it. More to the point, he does not own the property of families. The sanctity of property derives from both natural law and divine law, via the Old Testament.